Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos Ribbits and here is the musical theatre weather for where you are. Well, if you listen to the rain on the roof, you can tell there is a little fall of rain. We believe it comes from Spain and it may land on your parade. If you can also hear the wind, that's called Mariah. But the good news is that the sun will come out tomorrow and it will have its hat on, so do let the sunshine in. And with that piece of whimsy, I open this week's episode, which has nothing to do with the weather. So what is it going to be about, I hear you say? Which is odd, as I'm on my own in the house, in accordance with social distancing regulations. Well, today's episode follows on from last week in a way. You don't need to have heard last week's episode, but it does touch on some of the same points, because last week we were talking about a 21st century version of an 18th century piece of opera buffa, comic opera, which in its more recent version was called The Secretary Turned CEO. Originally, The Servant Mistress in English, by Persuasion. And if you listened to last week's episode, you'll have heard that it was a three-person opera where one of the characters didn't speak. Well, today we're going to be looking at two shows that arise, if you like, or at least can connect with, that opera. The first is an opera, but an absolutely spanking new 21st century opera, only written a couple of years ago, called Drive-By Shooting. It lasts about 8 minutes, it's available online in an animated form, and like The Secretary Turned CEO and its original forebear, The Servant Mistress, it has 2 singing characters and 1 silent character. So how fabulous to see that 300 years later, after Pergolesi's original intermezzo, that model of musical theatre is still being produced. And in the second half of the programme, we'll be talking about another brand new show, by which I mean created in the last couple of years, but which takes an 18th century text, the book Persuasion by Jane Austen, and then musicalises it by using contemporary music from the 18th century. So once again, that connects with The Secretary Turned CEO by having 18th century music placed into a 21st century piece. Now, these 3 shows that we've discussed, or will be discussing, are as unrelated to each other as it's possible to get in some ways, and yet there is still a thematic connection, and I think that's rather lovely. The other connection is that all 3 can be seen online. In last week's episode, I told you where you could find a video recording of The Secretary Turned CEO, and at the end of today's programme, I'll be telling you how you can see Drive-By Shooting and Persuasion, because they're both available on video streaming sites on the internet. So let's get down to business. In just a second, you'll hear a conversation I had with the wonderful Colm and Thos about Drive-By Shooting. And after that, we'll go immediately into a recording I made with the equally lovely Josh Clark about the show Persuasion when we saw it in Edinburgh only a few years ago. 2 very different discussions, 2 very different shows, but ones I hope that will be both entertaining, informative, and bring you just a little slice of the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, which we've missed so terribly in this awful year 2020. Musical Talk. Hello again, Colm. I'm going to ask you a very quick question. How many operas have you seen that have either A, only 3 cast members, I will accept The Secretary Turned CEO,
thank goodness,
or has 3 Zimmer frames included in it? This does narrow the field quite considerably.
Yes, it does. Just 2, Thos, I would say.
What would they be?
Well, the first would be The Secretary Turned CEO, and the second would be Drive-By Shooting with subtitle Shoot the Fecker in the Pecker.
Ironically, having just said the word pecker, I am going to have to remind you about Cox and Box. which of course is another three-handed comic opera.
Oh, is it really?
I just remembered.
That's funny.
There's probably more out there than we've been thinking. Oh, and obviously the word pecker reminds me of the word ampersand. So, drive-by shooting, sort of 10-minute operatic gem, I think, really. Tell us, what's your take on it? Describe it.
You originally introduced it to me as an animated opera recorded by an orchestra, sung by performers, and then animated, obviously to then be projected on a screen or a wall somewhere. But it is an Irish opera, and it concerns three old people. An old man, I think, who's called Eddie.
Yes.
Is that right? Who has done something to earn himself the title of the Fecker.
Which is a lovely piece of Irish slang, not a complimentary piece.
No, not. He's earned that title by two old women who are chasing him very slowly.
All three have the Zimmer frames.
All three have Zimmer frames. He doesn't know he's being chased, I assume.
He's deaf as a post, isn't he? Because he's had his hearing aid removed by one of the women.
He has. But from what I remember, he has been sleeping around. Is that correct?
That's right. One of the women is his wife, of many, many years standing. And he has told her that he no longer has it in him. So they've been having a purely sex-free elderly marriage. But it turns out that he's been visiting in a sexual way a lady who lives down the road.
Yes. And so she's decided she's had enough. And
this is the wife.
The wife. And her comrade are chasing him down purely with the intention of shooting him where the sun don't shine, I suppose.
Well, I think where the sun don't shine at the front.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, as you said earlier, shoot the fecker in the pecker.
Indeed.
Which I suspect most people will understand, but if you haven't come across that particular set of slang, it does mean to aim your firearm at the gentleman's front sports department. in the genitalia, yeah.
Well said.
Eventually. And this is all there is to it, isn't it? It's a 10-minute, very slow motion chase.
Yeah.
Which concludes with
him being shot.
Yeah,
twice.
It's like a geriatric Tarantino film in a sense.
And then they scarper for it.
And scarper we use in the slowest sense of the word. Yes, quite.
Well, I mean, it's considerably faster than they were chasing him.
That's true, but that's in a way does it a disservice. I mean, it's a light-hearted mini plot. And it is done firmly with tongue-in-cheek, I think, all the way through. Although the emotion within the piece is absolutely sincere. The wife is furious and hurt and angry.
And would rather, spend the rest of her life in jail, she concedes. And she manages to goad her friend into being complicit on the proviso that when they're in jail, they'll get 3 square meals a day, they'll get to see a dentist and a gynaecologist, which is probably... they've probably not been living that life for a while. Yeah. Yes,
it is part of her plan, isn't it, to not just murder her husband for infidelity, but to go to prison because essentially that is her pension plan. She'll be looked after. And this is the thing that I find most amazing about it, the most interesting thing about it, is that tonally it's clearly funny. And yet at the same time it has the power to move. I really feel, particularly for the wife,
yeah.
Because she does that every now and then. There are angst-ridden statements given in high operatic terms. I've given the best years of my life to this man. This is how he's repaid me. That she is facing poverty. They've never had money. That actually, what has she got? She said, I have literally nothing to lose. And she's right. She says she hasn't got enough money for food, let alone gynecology and dentistry. I mean, which literally covers all bases. But she. There's a huge amount of pathos, genuine pathos, in her predicament, I find. And on repeated viewing, I find it more and more moving. And that, I find, is very strange. I very rarely find something more moving upon increased viewing. Particularly when you're absorbing it for the very first time, it seems so tonally funny. Because it's such a curious setup.
Oh, sure.
Musically, how would you describe it?
I mean, it's contemporary classical sounding. It's quite... I guess if you've not heard music like that before, it's quite astringent and not necessarily tuneful, but there is a kind of chorus of gonna shoot the fecker in the pecker, which comes back every now and then, and I think that's its
catch.
Yeah, not that it's trying to be a kind of catchy score of any kind.
No. It has a hook, I suppose.
Oh yeah, but it works dramatically in its kind of peaks and troughs. It's really, really high and then really low and mournful at points. Really cleverly done, I would say. I think if I were to nitpick, it would be nice if, say, I think there's room to have more fast-paced wording in there, but that's always been my grief with opera, is that the speed they sing at can sometimes be quite slow, and I think people listening to opera are capable of listening to things that are spoken for. I mean, Rossini does it in his kind of Barbara of Seville stuff. They sing quite fast, and I think there is room for that.
Well, even in the British tradition, a Gilbert Patter song is always diddly diddly diddly, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, and that's a tradition that's run all the way through. Even as far as Pacific Overtures, when sometimes spoofing him in a way, but you can hear every word. So,
what did you think of the music?
Well, it's interesting because I'm coming at it from a very different point of view to you, because it's always lyrics first for me and music afterwards. And if my musical taste tends towards the more melodic, so I wouldn't be able to repeat back to you any of the melodic lines. But it was very interesting to me that because it's an animation. And the animation is quite a simplistic animation. It's actually subtitled a street art opera.
Yeah.
And it is what would be recognised as street art, or in the old-fashioned money, graffiti art. Very good graffiti art. They're very realistic and lifelike, but they are at the same time also impressionistic, if that makes any kind of sense. It's an impression of two old ladies and an old man, and they're lightly animated. So it's linear. The two ladies are on the left and the gentleman's on the right. He's a bit ahead of them. He's tone deaf, so he can't hear what's going on, so he doesn't know he's being chased, as we said. And there's a little bit of leg movement, so it always looks like they're always shuntering along a little bit. And then because it's subtitles as well, or rather the subtitle is incorporated into the art itself, so it's not at the bottom, it comes out organically across the screen, making it a very dynamic visual, in a way that almost compensates for the non-dynamic visual of the characters, because they don't move very much, being very old and mobility impaired because of their Zimmer frames. So I love that contrast. And then, as I say, it pulls tricks on you. We both remarked on this. Suddenly, it does a number of things. When they're particularly angry, when there's passion raging, when she's particularly angry or she's full of revenge, the font of the words gets bigger. So, the bigger the lettering, the more passion she's feeling. And you're caught up in this dynamic visual display, and then suddenly you realise they're no longer on the edge of the screen, but the two ladies have moved to the middle of the screen, so they're actually making progress on Eddie to shoot him down. So there is, there is a slow chase going on, but it is actually happening. You can see them catching up with him. So I love all the visuals on that, and that works really well. But the words, and this takes us back to what did I make of the music, because you can read the words as well as hear them, that does add to comprehension, ironically. It's very easy to be distracted by words, but the words are very clearly sung. These are professional opera singers, and they sing beautifully. And the cadences of the conversation that they are having fits comfortably on my ear as a real conversation. What it isn't done, as sometimes is supported by what might be called a particular... it's not supported by a corking melody. It's supported by music, but not melodic music, if that makes sense. So I'm speaking as a layperson here. And usually my taste is towards the melodic. And if this was lasting 2.5 hours, quite how you'd spin that out I wouldn't like to say, but if this was a 2.5 hour opera, I would find it harder. But it's 10 minutes. It's absolutely bite size. The supporting underlay of the music is exactly right for the cadences of the word, and I'm absolutely happy with that. And bearing in mind that, as we've said, the visuals enhance what's going on, but the dynamic is almost all explained in audio. This is an opera you could listen to on the radio, and you wouldn't be vastly disadvantaged.
That's true.
Whereas actually you saw it on stage, and we'll talk about this in a minute, or live, it would be interesting to see it live, but there's a big question as to whether it would actually aid the enhancement of the understanding. I think the words are doing almost all the work here. That's my feeling and response to it.
Oh, sure, I think so. And I think conventionally, when an opera is staged, there are some kind of subtitles so people can follow what's going on, because in whether in a concert hall or whether it's outside or in a non-conventional space, it can be quite hard to follow what an opera singer is singing.
There is something about the enunciation of diction in opera which is different to musicals proper, shall we say, and you're right, and it doesn't always aid comprehension. No. Although it was in English. It's obviously an Irish story and the performers were singing with an Irish accent. I assume they're Irish performers, but the English was crystal clear, actually. It was lovely to hear an opera in English that was so, the words helped, but it wasn't in any way difficult to comprehend, I thought. A couple of things I should say, by the way. I saw this in Edinburgh when it was up a few years ago, and the way they did it in Edinburgh, because I think, being an animation with recorded sound, they were able to you could play it anywhere. But when it came to Edinburgh, it was available on a kind of permanent loop from about 2:00 in the afternoon until about midnight at the venue called Summer Hall, which is one of those very rare, fully independent venues in the Edinburgh environment during the Fringe. It's an enormous complex. I think it's a kind of sort of school, college environment, so it's got lots and lots and lots and lots of rooms, ideal for putting on shows. But on this occasion, they were merely using an outside wall, but you could only attain it by being in the complex. So you bought your ticket,
Yes.
and what they gave you was a set of headphones. And then you went out to the area where it was being beamed on the wall and waited for it to start. So you could walk in the street and just see it, but all you'd get was purely the animation. You'd be seeing the words, so you'd be able to understand what was going on,
Sure.
but you wouldn't hear any of the music, and so you'd miss quite a lot of the fun of it. And then me and whoever was in my cohort on the occasion I went, I'm quite late, about 11 o'clock in the evening, we sat outside and you just watched it beaming up on the wall, and then in synchronicity the music came on in your headphones as the performance started in terms of the animation on the wall.
Nice.
Just a beautiful, lovely sort of 10 minutes. It was a perfect curtain closer for my day, if you like.
Yeah.
And I had such fond memories on it. I very, very much enjoyed it. And then when it turned up on YouTube, I was delighted, hence the fact we're able to review it.
Oh, sure, yes.
But we have touched in this conversation upon whether or not a live performance would enhance this 10-minute mini opera. Now, we've had actually the opportunity to find out, or at least some sense of finding out, because there's a reference in it to the what I believe is the siege of the General Post Office building in 1916 in Ireland, which is a very significant moment of Irish history, as I understand it, leading towards the creation of what was the Irish Free State in 1922.
Yes.
So it's the road to independence. And I'm very sorry to say it's an atrocity as well, I believe.
Yeah.
But the term GPO means something very significant in Irish history. And it's a shameful thing to say, but many of us in Britain will not be aware of that. I certainly wasn't taught that at school myself. It was on the strength of this opera that I found out about it.
Oh, wow, gosh.
And was appalled. But that's slightly by the by. But what did happen is, and I think this is magnificent, in that very building, the magnificent sort of Victorian edifice, General Post Office building, which is only mentioned in passing in this opera, but they performed it there one day live in a kind of flash performance. I'm sure it must have been it was done by it was clearly organised, because there was a man behind some screens with the tech desk, so it's not the kind of thing you could just wheel into a post office and perform. But it wasn't performed in the sense of advertised for the public, so there did appear to be a lot of members of the public using the post office as a post office.
Oh, sure, yes.
Whilst a number of people had stopped to watch this very strange little 3-person drama develop. Do you want to take it from there? How did it look to you? Because we watched it. We watched the animated version, and then we watched the film of the Speech Marks live performance in the post office.
Yeah, it was a good quality film of the live performance. I think, from what I gather, that recording of the live version used the overlay of the pre-recorded visual version.
It certainly felt like that, didn't it? It didn't feel like we were hearing them actually singing in the GPO themselves.
No, I mean, which is fine, and I imagine it's because that room looked cavernous, so maybe there were acoustic issues. But it seemed to engage the audience. It's just a bugbear, but I think given the staging and given how, again, difficult it is to hear opera and discern the words in such a cavernous space, I wonder if that kind of thing, as great as it is to do a kind of flash mob thing, there probably should be a clearer way, or an accessible way, where people can follow what's going on visually. They can follow the text.
Yeah.
And they were handing out, there were sheets that people were reading from, but I don't think everyone was reading them. It was fun, and I think I enjoyed it just as much as the animation, but the animation is quirky.
Yes.
I think.
You should start with the animation.
Yeah.
Don't watch the live version, I'd say, until you've watched the original.
Yeah.
And even between the two, if you watch both, it's still only 20 minutes of your life. So
That's true.
the thing I found very interesting, and it's one of my problems with flash mob style performance, or if you like, members of the public being invited just to see something as it appears to happen naturally, is that you see, first of all, you get to see how the audience are reacting, and there are a lot of people with smiles on their faces. There are a lot of people with slightly curious looks on their faces. As it was a post office, there were people walking past to get a postal order or buy a stamp or whatever, use it as a post office. So you had all those kind of things, but the thing that takes you out, particularly if you are watching recording of that, I expect if you're in the room, there's the atmosphere and the we're all in this together and isn't this strange and what's going on and this performance is grand. But watching the recording of the live performance, if that makes any kind of sense, is a little bit Brechtian in the sense of I found myself watching the audience as much as the performance, which I guess I probably wouldn't be doing if I was in the auditorium, which is the post office in this case. So it drew me away from, and when I say the action, I mean this in the loosest possible sense, two old ladies very, very slowly chasing one old man. I got the whole ambience of the room and the whole spectrum of the people in that room, which was not just the performers, but the performers plus the audience as well. So the audience themselves became performers in our interpretation of what we were watching.
Yes.
So it's a further step away.
Yeah.
The performance was brilliant. I mean, I assume that they didn't overlay the soundtrack, but they were miming to it in the room.
No, I don't think so. I think they were singing it live.
Oh, you think it would have, if we'd been there, we'd have heard them singing properly?
I think so.
Right, that's interesting, because I couldn't tell. But the recording we got had overlaid it.
Yeah.
Well, that's perfectly possible too. Well, and it makes more sense actually. Why on earth would you have? Yes, because they were the proper opera singers too. So, no, you're quite right. I think it must have been exactly as you say. Right. If we'd have been there, we'd have heard them sing, but we weren't hearing them sing on the recording as they were acoustically in the room. But it was interesting to see them. I will say this: the two ladies in particular didn't appear to be quite old enough to be the old man's husband.
No, they didn't.
But that's not their fault. There was a lot of old person acting, wasn't there? There was stooping over Zimmer frames and...
Josephine Barstow was busy.
No, you're going to have to tell me who that is.
Oh, she played Heidi in Follies.
Recently, the old lady who sings the operetta number.
Yeah.
One More Kiss, is it?
Yeah.
Yes. And you need two of her.
That's asking the impossible, Thos.
Well, we saw two of the character in Follies because she is haunted by her own younger self.
She is, you're right. Yeah.
So bringing us back to drive-by shooting, we would recommend it?
Oh yeah,
I certainly would.
Absolutely.
But we would recommend people watch the animated video first and then go on to the live performance in the post office if they wish to do so.
Yes.
So it's designed for the animation, and that's where it is at its strength. I'd love to see more work by the people behind it.
Yeah, me too.
I think that brings to an end our review of drive-by shooting, but I will just say this. In the live performance, which we saw much more acutely, she shoots Eddie in the back with his own father's revolver, which was involved in the 1916 siege, but he falls to the ground on his back, he rolls over, and then she shoots him in the pecker, as promised. And there's a kind of sort of body reaction to that. He sort of raises all his legs and hands. It looks like it looks much more painful and horrifying in the live version than it does.
Oh, sure.
And that, fun enough, has a kind of counter work for me. Whereas on the animation, I can take it within the spirit of it all being silly. Actually, watching the murder of an old man and then the mutilation of his body in a pseudo live environment, shall we say, did leave a slightly different flavour at the end of it.
Yes, especially when there were children 5 feet away as well watching this quite weird experience.
Yeah. So, yes, I'd like to know what their psychological profiles will be in 10, 15 years' time when they've all grown up. But whilst we're waiting, we'd recommend everybody go and see this.
For sure.
Well, thank you, Colm. Fantastic to share your insights on this street art opera.
Thank you.
Musical talk. Josh, I say this every year, but every year it's still true, which is it's always a great pleasure to talk to you and to hear about what you've been doing up in Edinburgh this year.
Yes, well, thank you very much once again for inviting me back. It's always a highlight for me as well, so delighted to be back on Musical Talk again.
Thank you very much indeed. Here's the money.
Thank you. Very kind.
Usually in the past you've acted in a musician's role or in an actor's role, performer in some way, and therefore you've been very high above me on a plinth because you're one of the creatives, whereas one of the parasites on the body, creative, which is what we reviewers are. But this year you've decided to descend to my level because actually, I joke of course, but you are actually up here in an official capacity this year as a reviewer, I think.
I am. I think too many people have probably seen my previous performances and
there was a petition, was it?
I was unable to get myself into anything in that vein this year.
Oh, stop, you're excellent.
No,
and you can turn your hand to almost everything.
Well, that's it. I mean, always like to try lots of different things, so I wanted to come up in some sort of semi-professional capacity, as it were. So I was looking around and managed to get myself onto reviewing for one of the publications or websites.
One of the big reviewers, yeah.
One of the big ones, which has been fabulous actually, saving a lot of money on paying for shows, but probably paying for it in terms of time and having to write them all up. But it's a privilege to do it.
And as part of the shows that you've seen, in your schedule, you have seen, of course, a number of musicals and things that you get in here in Edinburgh quite a lot, shows which aren't quite musicals but which are plays with music or have some musical theatre or musical theatrical element to them. And so today we're going to be talking about really those things you've seen, some of which I've seen too, and some of which I haven't. And I think we're going to start with a show that we've both seen, not at the same performance.
No.
But will give us plenty of things to talk about. And I think we should say that we were talking casually about this in a corridor a few days ago. And someone else who had seen the show decided that it would be a jolly good thing to drop in their conversational views as well.
Yes.
So this is obviously a show that people are literally talking about. What are we talking about here?
So this is Persuasion, billed as a new musical drama, so obviously it's based upon the novel of the same name by Jane Austen. Now I mentioned in the review that I wrote of this that it probably is one of her least well-known novels.
Yes, I think it is actually, although it has been turned into at least one film.
Yes, I mean she only wrote I think 4 during her time, despite being one of the most well-known literary names in Britain, I guess. But one of her shorter novels is written about the same time as Northanger Abbey, so it's one of the shorter ones towards the end of her life.
Which is the prequel to Downton, isn't it?
Indeed, yes, and I'm sure there is some...
It isn't, I do know.
No, there is some version of Downton up here as well, actually, which I've not seen.
There is indeed.
But Persuasion, this adaptation comes from America and is fairly operatic, really. It is billed under the musical theatre section of the Fringe, but it is really operetta.
Indeed, the company, I think, is the Chamber Opera Chicago.
It is, which is a professional company, so you expect high things of them, and it's been quite a few years in the making. It was really the creative vision of one woman, really, Barbara Landis, who's done a remarkable job in terms of the work she's put into it, having written the book, collected a lot of the music, which we both know is authentic favourite pieces of the period, but favourite pieces of Jane Austen herself.
It's from some of the bits of music are from her own sort of musical collection of sheet music, aren't they?
Yes, that's right. And the company have worked with archivists in Bath itself to research exactly the sorts of things that Jane Austen would have been interested in and what she would have actually listened to. So we've got some really authentic chamber music played by a wonderful orchestra. I
think you're right to say authenticity is the attempt here. It is a fairly full reading of Persuasion, and we'll talk about that in a minute. As you say, with contemporary from the period music played perfectly contemporary with new lyrics. I think the lyrics have been taken as far as possible from the book or private letters.
Yes.
So Ms. Landis has incorporated and interpolated some private correspondence from Jane Austen into the text as well.
Yes.
So it's a very it's an attempt to be authentic. It's an attempt to be loving. It really is a labour of love, in fact, isn't it? It is.
Yeah, very much so. I really was impressed by the amount of authentic text that made it into the dialogue, actually. So I read the book on the way up to Edinburgh to ensure I was well informed on it. At least 50% of it, as far as I could tell, was from Jane Austen's own words, which is quite an impressive thing to do when creating a new off-spin, as it were.
Yes. Or spin-off, as we used to use.
Or spin-off, yes.
You've
Very
just become
good.
a civil servant.
Thank you.
I'll tell you more about that when you upgrow.
Okay, nice.
So, that sets the scene, and I must say I hadn't read the book, so I don't know the story. But the thing for me is, the reason I decided to see it is because it looked slightly different from the usual run-of-the-mill kind of musicals. It looked full-on, and it certainly was. It looked to me that it was going to be sumptuous. There are a few YouTube clips of previous performances which looked very impressive. So I thought this is the kind of thing. And also, there's a trend developing, I must tell you, as you and I come up here year on year. We both spot things which are happening. Jane Austen is having a real fringe revival in the last few years. There was Jane Austen the musical last year by Rob Winlow. There has for the last 2 or 3 years been an improvised Jane Austen play called Ostentatious, which is always well worth catching. I notice there's another musical called Promise and Promiscuity, a new musical, which is it's supposed to be sort of Jane Austen-esque. They're very much trading on the Jane Austen concept. So Jane Austen is really, she's big at the Fringe and has been big at the Fringe for the last 3 or 4 years. And so, but this is the first time I think anything sort of a genuine adaptation of one of her works has made it to the top of the heap. So, what did you think of it?
Well, On the whole, I really enjoyed it. It was my first night at the Fringe this year, so it was one of the first things I'd seen, and it was the first time I'd seen a show in the very luxurious venue of the assembly rooms, wasn't it?
Yes.
That's
and it is it's one of the grandest assembly rooms of the rooms available.
Yes, very much so. Chandeliers and carvings. Yeah, absolutely wonderful. So a great setting for it to be held in. A special mention to the orchestra, I think, first of all.
I agree with you, absolutely. The orchestra were flawless. Well, they were the night I went.
Very much so. These are proper professional musicians at the top of their game, actually. Some of the piano work and the strings were absolutely right on the money.
And these are intricate pieces. I mean,
Yes.
This is 18th century music for the most part, and when you think of 18th century music, you think of, I must say this dreadfully, but as a layperson, but sort of plinky-plonky, harpsichordy, Mozartian, which, whatever you think of it, is always fairly intricate. Now, it's obviously a bit more sophisticated than that, and the music that we got was actually of a much wider range, but it's not simplistic.
No, not at all. And it was a fairly large size orchestra for the Fringe. I mean, it was a full chamber orchestra, so we had the full complement of strings, the woodwind, and a drum kit at the back, which is a nice modern spin on it. But yeah, very successful musically, for sure. As you say, a very faithful versioning of the text, so the characters were all there, as was much of the plot. I did notice, actually, Persuasion, the novel, has got 2 alternate almost endings. It's a little section before the end, which was an original, and then a couple of chapters which I do believe Austen wrote as well, but which replaced the original ending. So I think we had the original versioning here, because I got a little bit lost at that point and then realised this must be the version that I hadn't read on the way up.
Oh, right, okay.
So just a little point of interest there, but very well acted in the main.
Yes, I'd say so. I mean, it was an enormous cast.
Yes.
I mean, I'm going to put my cards on the table and say that I found there was very much to admire, slightly less to like. And we'll talk about the reasons for that in a minute. But the things that really stuck out for me as excellent were the music, absolutely. It all felt authentic. It added to the authenticity. The fact there was a cast of about 30 people,
yes,
and they were wearing different costumes throughout, so the seamstress has done an amazing job, really had as well. There was plenty of action on the stage, and it was a big stage to fill.
Yep.
There were projections, very cleverly used, which I thought actually were very effective. So
yes.
I don't mind modern stage technique even in a Speech Marks authentic show, because I don't particularly want to see a show as it would have been done in the 18th century. And so that was fine, but that really gave it scope. It has the scope of a novel, the ambition and scope of a novel, because you're in Lyme Regis, and you're in Bath, and you're elsewhere, and you're inside a stately home, and you're outside a stately home,
yes,
and wherever you are. So that was absolutely fantastic and world-making. I like that. There was a world was being created. I liked the actors who had the confidence to play with their roles. The chap who plays the baronet, who gets into financial difficulties in the beginning, which sets off the whole stream of events, was enjoying himself.
Yes.
And as a result, I was enjoying myself too. And I think we should talk about the Irish dancers.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because, and once again, this was in the programme notes, it was researched in the sense that at this time in British history, Ireland was part of Britain. There were Irish sailors and soldiers, and there's a very strong nautical element and navy element to this story. So we see Irish sailors on land in pub during some of their times when they're berthed, shall we say, or not at sea, and they do this fantastic proper Irish dancing, which is as authentic as presumably it can be, because it would have happened. And so these 2 lads came on. I say lads, they were men, but they were young men, and did this fantastic Irish dancing, the no hands or feet kind of kicking the air and jigging, to use the non-technical terms, and they looked fantastic. They did, however, come on twice more during the performance, to diminishing returns. I think the first time they really raised the roof and put a lot of energy into the show about halfway through, because it was a long show. But then the second time they were very good as well. But by the third time, when they come on and do a little dance with Anne, our heroine, I think the audience was thinking, get on with it.
Yeah, well, the thing is, as you say, they were very accomplished, and in fact are semi-professional Irish dancers. I think they're still at university in America, but compete in international Irish dance tournaments and are ranked sort of 4th and 6th in the world themselves. So yeah, the level of that was fantastic to watch, and it really accompanied a few of the sea shanty songs really well. Got the audience going after a little bit of a lull, I felt. But yes, you're right, perhaps a little bit overused.
So those are the things I liked best about it. What did you like best, before we talk on one or two of those things which may have not diminished it, but have made it slightly harder to swallow than perhaps I was expecting it to be?
Well, I think two things. There were, as you say, a few performances that were completely immersive and looked as though the performers were really having fun with them.
Yes.
So you've got a pair of twins, or that's how you say it, isn't it? A pair of twins, that's right.
That's the right number.
One set of twins, that's right.
These three twins.
Two sisters, one set, who really brought a sense of fun to the piece.
Yes, they did. They were playful, weren't they?
They were playful, very giggly, so they were fun to watch. And there were some absolutely extraordinary vocal performances as well.
Yes.
There was a real strength and depth all the way down through the cast. It's a wonderful male ensemble, which a few of them had the opportunity to showcase their own individual talents from time to time. There was one particular fairly quiet member of the ensemble who had a couple of moments just to himself, and I don't know how to describe it, but the sheer skill of his opera singing, up to quite a high tenor, was one of the highlights actually for me. So to be honest, I think it was those little moments of standout excellence which brought it all together.
Now, the reason I said I admired it rather than quite liked it, I think, well, we've heard from me at least about what I admired, and you've just spotted your highlights. I don't want to be churlish when I say those things which I think worked against it, but I will say it had one or two things which troubled me. The first was its length.
Yes.
It did have an interval. It was advertised at running at 2 hours and 2 hours and 15, I think it is.
Yeah, that's right.
And was supposed to finish. It was quite a late night performance.
Yes.
And was supposed to finish at 1:45. We eventually got out at about 1:30 midnight. We had rolled into the next day, and the show therefore was essentially 3 hours. Now, a 3-hour show that finishes at 1:30 midnight feels like quite a long show, and it did. If I was making a criticism of it, and the easiest thing to fix is that I think it needs at least half an hour chopping out of it. And one of the ways that might be done is, this might seem counterintuitive for a programme about musical theatre, is to remove some of the songs.
Yeah. Because
there were a plethora. And they were wonderful, and they were varied, and they were almost universally well sung. I think no problem with that at all. But there was a touch that almost every couple of lines of dialogue we'd go into a song. And that can be quite wearing if that's the rhythm that's developing, and it did. By that last hour, that rhythm felt like, oh Lord, here's another song. And indeed I heard one of the ushers being asked by another usher in the interval, are you enjoying it? And he said, well, yes, I am enjoying it, but there are too many songs. He actually used a slightly stronger phrase than that. And he seemed to suggest, and there's some truth in this, that you could, the orchestra there'd always be a little intro to each song, so the dialogue would come to its sort of natural rhythm conclusion, and then there'd be a little introduction of music, and he said in his case he would just lie back rolling his eyes thinking, oh Lord, here comes another song.
To be honest, I think part of the reasoning for that, thinking about it, is that this is an opera company,
and you would expect a lot of aria.
That's right, and it's been written by someone very well established in the world of opera rather than musical theatre.
You make a very good point.
And so to try and create ostensibly a piece of musical theatre,
ostensibly, Jane ostensibly.
Oh my!
Yeah, I like what you did there.
Yes. Oh dear. Yes, I think what we've ended up with is actually the music of an opera with the book of a musical put together without them completely marrying.
This marriage isn't quite the one of Figaro, is it?
No, indeed. Very good.
I think you've put your finger, by Jove, I think you've got it, as they say in another show. I think that might be true. You're right. It is, because I appreciate it is slightly churlish to be complaining about the number of songs, but it is a light opera.
Yeah, because that would traditionally be just completely sung through, wouldn't it?
Yeah. But it did have dialogue.
Oh yeah,
recitative or whatever it's called. There was also a framing device which I didn't think was necessary, which is that actually Barbara Landis, who I think all praise to her. There is no doubt she's done a wonderful job, and this show deserves to exist and deserves to be enjoyed. She also played Jane Austen herself, which is the framing device, and Anne. Now, there is the age-old question about whether the right quality of singer will have the right age for the characters. This is the old idea of Carmen often being cast as a larger lady or an older lady or both. Barbara Landis is by no means old, and she's by she's certainly a svelte woman, I'm sure she'll be delighted to know. But she's not quite in the age range of Anne in the book. But she does play Jane Austen as well. So this framing device is you see Jane Austen not feeling tremendously well in her 40s, and then her nephew and niece turn up with Auntie Jane tell us a story. And the story she decides to tell is every page of Persuasion. They were very tolerant children because they seemed to enjoy it for 3 hours. But I didn't think you actually needed that. I think the piece is strong enough not to need a framing device. So I'd have actually liked us just to got into Persuasion and get on with it. And it somewhat can pull focus when every now and then your central character, Anne, suddenly reverts to being Jane Austen. This is a very small point, but it did enough to pull me out of the text. And you could comfortably dispose of that, I think.
Yes, I think you're right. I didn't mind it initially as a plot device. I thought, okay, this is interesting, and actually what they have tried to do in creating the work is to give a lot of praise to Jane Austen, and it is a celebration of her.
It is,
isn't it, with the music and the faithfulness to the text and the use of her personal letters, etc.
Well, she runs through it, doesn't
absolutely,
she?
Absolutely.
A golden thread.
Golden thread. I think, as you sort of allude to there, the way that they affect that on the stage isn't always consistent. They start off by making the costume changes between Jane and Anne, the way that they're going to distinguish between these two roles, whereas that gets a little bit lax towards the end, and it doesn't always happen, and so you don't always distinguish fully when these switches are taking place. But you're right, I think it could be left out without not to the detriment of the actual piece. In terms of the performance of Anne, again, if we're going down this line of authenticity, really it is the one thing that isn't quite authentic in terms of the playing age of the character. And you did briefly just hint at the voice that's been written for Anne, actually, and you mentioned Carmen there, and Carmen is quite unique in some ways in the opera world for being written as the leading lady part, but being written for a mezzo soprano rather than for a genuine top-end soprano.
Because, right, that's really interesting. I didn't know that.
No, and genuinely that's what the main leading lady roles are written for, top sopranos.
In 1875, what a radical move.
Well, yeah, indeed, and very few mezzo parts are written as the lead. And I think that is part of the problem here, that Anne has been written as a mezzo-soprano rather than you would expect a 27-year-old young lady part to be a soprano, I think. Which,
yes, I think you would, actually.
To some extent, it's almost as though the part of Anne has been written for Barbara Landis to perform.
I wouldn't in any way criticise her for that, because it's a labour of love and it's
absolutely,
her baby. But I do know what you're saying.
Yeah.
It sets it apart, therefore, slightly from what might be seen as a convention.
Yes. And a mezzo song isn't quite going to reach, or it will do so in a different way, the emotions of a very high register soprano song. It's always going to have a slightly different feel.
That's you make once again a really interesting point there, I think. I'm so glad you're here, because I wouldn't have been able to nail down what these little points are. But I think we're both agreed that there's such a lot of good in this piece.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it has had a history, and it deserves to go on further. But it's like everything else. It could be made slightly better. It could be, and it would be interesting to see how it would come across with a totally different cast.
Yes,
if it escaped the group for whom it was written.
Yes, I do think though it's probably going to, for its lifetime, going to have a mainly professional run. It would be a very difficult piece.
It would indeed
to take out of the professional world. But perhaps that's a good thing for it, that it's always going to be given a similar treatment in terms of the high production values that we saw here, which is not a bad thing at all.
Musical talk. And there we are. That was Josh Clark talking about Jane Austen's Persuasion, with its genuine 18th century music. Now, that could have been seen at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe in 2015. And the driving force behind it was Barbara Landis. And remember, if you'd like to see Persuasion, you can do so. That's one of the wonderful things about this year's virtual Edinburgh Festival Fringe. And the place to find it is on YouTube. Search for Persuasion 2016, Show 5, Title 0101. Or go to the videos of ASCAP Kid 1, ASCAP KID 1. And before that, we heard from Colm and Thos as we discussed Drive-By Shooting, which you could have seen at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe in 2018, and which is described as a street art opera, and was created by John McIlduff and Brian Irvin. And if you want to see that, you can. It's the animated version, the very version which I saw beamed on the wall at Summerhall at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe in 2018, and you can find that on Vimeo. If you type in vimeo.com/255913894, or alternatively type in Drive-By Shooting (a street art opera) --full version. It'll only take 10 minutes of your life and you certainly won't regret it. And even in the 2-minute countdown clock that's featured on the video before we actually get to the action, I think you'll be delighted, as I was, to realise that the ticking sound of the clock as it counts down the seconds is in fact the sound of a revolver being cocked. It's thoughtful, clever, and a little bit darkly funny. Strongly recommended. Well, there we are. That's it, I think, for the time being. With this week's episode and last week's, we've triangulated the 18th century and its enduring influence in the musical theatre of the 21st century. And it does make you wonder how people might be talking about us in the 24th century. I think it's unlikely any of us will ever find out, but we can live in hope, and indeed living is what we'll have to do if we want to find out. But best not dwell too much on that, for that way madness lies. And with that forecast, to match the weather forecast at the beginning of the show, I think it must be time for me to say farewell. Or perhaps more accurately, the word that I've grown to use on a regular basis and which you've grown to love, which is me saying goodbye. And here's me doing it now. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk, edited by Thos Ribbits and presented by Thos Ribbits, Colm Malloy and Josh Clark. Copyright Musical Talk 2020. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on iTunes and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can, at Musical Talk Thos.